years ago.
Oh, we need to, right. I think so.
From ordinance by call, August 24th, 2021 Safety Committee meeting to order. Stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I believe in the flag. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Let the record show all members of the committee are present. Councilman Avens, Councilman Jacob, and myself, Chairwoman Holly Swank. Also present is the Safety Service Director, Councilman Molesky, Councilman Winkle, Council President Margaret Reed, Nancy Linda, Clerk of Council, Sherry Ma, Assistant Clerk of Council, and Tina Weaver, the Deputy Clerk of Council, and also the Chief of Police. Before you have the Administrative Committee meeting. You have before you the Safety Committee meeting minutes of February 7th, 2018. Are there any corrections or additions to the meeting minutes? Hearing none, minutes stand as approved. We are here to discuss the following, which are somewhat related. The T94/2021 and ordinance amending certain sections of the NRCO Chapter 476, snowmobiles, off-highway motorcycles, and all-purpose vehicles. We are going to have a lobby session at some point after members of the committee, council members, and others speak. You may utilize Zoom and YouTube, and you can type to ask any questions and they will be read aloud. State your name and address for the record. And at this time, I'm going to ask Councilman Molesky to give an overview of the legislation.
Thank you. So about a year and a half ago, got a message from a resident that was asking, had some issues with some riders close to the property with sound and time and distance with the property. And so I reached out to that particular resident, and like probably a lot of people in this room thought it might have been a one-off or might have been a situation where neighbors were disagreeing. So the more I dove into it, I saw that it was a pretty intense problem between that neighbor and the other person. Plus, there were some other people within the city that were having the same issue. Went back and looked at some attempts at some previous legislation that was done in 2017 or 18 to try to adjust the sound ordinance, or noise ordinance, I'm sorry, to try to help the people with the issues with the ATVs. And looking at the notes, came up with some different ways of looking at it, some different ways of doing some research. So before I got started with all that, I came up with a couple of goals that we wanted to set in trying to create this legislation. Was first to try to update the ordinance to fit the modern city that we do live in. Use industry standards language, sound versus noise, which I'll talk here about that in a second. Work within the guidelines for everyone, residents and residents who are riders, and then establish enforceable codes. So one of the things that I saw in the comments of the previous meeting was people who were against it or mentioning referencing the American Motorcycle Association. So I went ahead and reached out to the sorry. All right, so I reached out to the American Motorcycle Association myself, talked to a gentleman named Nick Harris from there, and he gave me some suggestions. He said that when you're creating a new sound ordinance, you want to look at property, sound standards, and also a fair enforcement. He talked to calling it a sound ordinance because we call it a noise ordinance that more or less is a nuisance, what's annoying to one might not be annoying to everybody. But a sound gives us a quantifiable measurement, and it's measured in a certain way that we'll talk here about in a second. And then he also mentioned that there should be reasonable hours of operation. So the sound standard that he mentioned was at 96 decibels. But normal conversations at about 64 or 65. So after he got through this conversation with me and offered me the suggestions, he told me to call a gentleman who's by the name of Chris Reel, who's actually a noise expert for the state of California. He works for GPS Technical. He's the owner and he educates people in sound ordinances. He wrote some of the national sound ordinances for the southern part of Canada. He also wrote the ordinance for Blanford County, California, which has a lot of motorcycle and bike enthusiasts within the state of California. So he was a forerunner in creating the legislation that worked over there in California. So again, what he told me was, so normal conversations at that level of 60 to 65. And how it's measured, if you do it using a particular tool at 20 inches away from the exhaust at a 50% RPM over a certain time period, accounting for what's going on in the surrounding area, that anything over that should be considered a violation of a sound ordinance. It would be considered a nuisance for most. So in talking with this, and he said, as far as distances go, and I know that was kind of an issue with the 5 acres, which again, we're willing to move that down to 3. That's open for conversation. When they say a reasonable distance, we're looking at a community that still has a lot of people with large acres. And also the time-wise. Now, the time that's written in there as it stands right now, again, is open for negotiation. This is legislation. We do go back and forth on this to make sure it works for everybody. But we all know that 7 p.m. in December is a lot different than 7 p.m. in the summer as far as day and night go. So that's something to be considered as we go forward with that. So when putting this all together and looking at this all, that we thought that this would be the best way to try to help people with their particular issues that they're having with ATVs and bike riders, and it's not against them. And I know we have a lot of people that are trying to attempt to ride in Meadow Lakes, Avalon. Myself, I live in Meadow Lakes. My daughter was 2, had people riding in my backyard. And those of you who've been through Meadow Lakes know that's tight and it should be considered unacceptable. This isn't meant to hurt the people who are following the rules. It doesn't hurt people who are using it to plow, using it for agricultural purposes. Actually, I'm sitting in the parking lot on my way here today. I was talking to a gentleman who was saying that people had built a dirt track in their backyard and were riding it at all hours of the night. In a smaller property than 3 acres. So I think that something does need to be done to benefit both sides with it. And I think going from 5 to 3 acres and maybe adjusting the time to daylight savings would probably be suitable for all, but also making sure that we make it that quantifiable measure. I've had multiple meetings with the law director, with Chief Freeman sat in on a couple of those. The early goings on, Councilman Winkle was part of it, but then I kind of took it and ran with it. I have a little bit easier time in the summer with being a teacher and having that time off doing these things. So we do want to make it workable for everybody, but I think it's also makes it easier and enforceable for our law enforcement using the tool that we do have in place to be able to measure this. Now, I had a conversation with a woman yesterday that said, well, once it's law, it's law. So I don't foresee this as our officers driving up and down streets at 5 or 6 acres looking for somebody to put this sound machine up against it and make sure they're at the right decibels. Think of it as a more of a complaint-driven piece of legislation. But it's I tried to take into consideration the American Motorcycle Association suggestions, along with knowing the kind of town that we live in, with both developments and those type of people want to live that style, but also the agricultural and people with the larger pieces of property. So I'd be more than willing to answer any questions, or entertain any thoughts or changes to it as well.
Thank you, Councilman Lasky. Does anybody on the committee have any questions?
The tool that would be required to measure this. City already have.
City has one, to my understanding, because it was used at one point to come out to the one residence where they had the issue. But the group that I talked to, the gentleman Nick Harris from the American Motorcycle Station, says that there's training that is available for our policemen. But I know that that's at a cost and also time away from their job here. They do a great job making us one of the safest towns in the area, the state. I don't want to take them away, but I know that that training is provided for them as well to be able to use it the correct way.
What is the cost for one of those units?
I see $100 to $150 per device. Now the training itself probably around that $1,000 to $1,500, depending on how many officers they're spending the day, because it is down in Columbus where that training would have to take place.
Does anyone in the administration have any comments or questions? Please, Chief.
I think this is a lot like the hunting ordinance, where there was some people who their property, but at the same time, you have to consider those people who find this constant noise on problem. So I think there is no yet. I think you're absolutely right. It's not something, obviously, this is going to be complaint generated. Where obviously, there are situations where it's all hours of the day. And I think that's where it's under, where people aren't being good neighbors. They're writing that thing 8 to 10 hours a day. And people obviously get somewhat cut out. So we're not talking about a situation here where I think everybody can be tolerable for a certain amount of time. But right, 6 to 8 to 10 hours a day, even at decent decibel levels, it's a bit under.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So I think hopefully we can find some middle ground where people can enjoy their property for what it is, but at the same time, find some peace and tranquility on their piece of property.
Exactly. Yes, I agree. And if I'm not mistaken, I reached out to our clerk reports, and they said that there was over 1,000 noise complaints since 2017. We've already had 90 this year, and I know that's a mixed bag of a lot of those could be 4th of July. To sit and go through 1,000 noise complaints, but I mean, I do know this is definitely not a one-off. I've had at least 5 to maybe even 6, if I go back and look at my records, different residents across the city reach out to me. But out of 1,000 complaints since 2017, there are ATVs, and it has become problematic.
Is there any member of council that has any comments or questions?
For the chair, what is the decided decibel level at this point? Right now, and what will it be in the future?
There is no current decibel level. It's this would provide that quantitative measurement, because right now it's written as a noise ordinance, which is again, you might have a higher tolerance to something than I do, and it's not about that 6:30 in the morning trash can that's smacking down on that we all hear every day. It's that consistent time over a certain time period with a certain number that would be presented.
This is where it's problematic because it is residential boundary. But like you said, probably muffled device, whether it be a lawnmower, whether it be an ATV, as long as they're riding within 100-foot border, they're not in violation of the noise ordinance, because obviously we're doing by ATV ordinance. So these two things are crossing. That's where it becomes problematic.
Also, is there a time limit set for how long the noise has been going on? Is it a 1-minute situation where someone's hauling logs, or it's going on? Is there a certain time set for how long?
Well, that's where this would clarify that, because it's over a 5-minute period at 20 inches from the exhaust at 50% RPM. So if it is 5 minutes of plowing the driveway, doing wood, or riding it normally, and if it's above that 96, then you're above that level that would be considered violation of sound ordinance.
My guess too is probably, in other words, my guess, I'm not much better. My guess there's a number out there of a properly muffled device how it comes off the line. I take it more likely. I'm not a motorcycle. In other words, something that comes off the factory that's not tinkered with. there a certain
Yeah,
decibel?
the only way
limit?
they're louder is if kids are putting on,
Right,
racing mufflers or whatnot.
Is there a decimal?
There's a
The Harley is louder than a,
A weed whacker is louder
Right.
right now than
Right.
whatever number he's coming up with.
see, that's where you're gonna fall into problems. You got different model numbers, you got different makes, models, and obviously they come off the line with one spec. The next brand comes off, or whether the bike sits, third bike can run an ATV. That's where you become, that's where the checking it becomes problematic. It's like you said, weed whackers on it. I could weed whack my lawn all day if I want.
But again, the number wasn't something that was just
No,
came up out of the blue.
No,
This was with the American Motorcycle Association and the national standard is actually uses as their number for ATVs and motor vehicles and things of that nature.
The 82.
No, 94 to 96.
Okay, because that what this 82 is popping up on here is what I'm stuck on because leaf blowers, weed whackers, anything. I can run my backpack blower either on high throttle or I can pull the trigger or I can run it. There's various ways, but it can scream for hours if I'm blowing leaves. I got 13 and a half acres. So if you're restricted on what I do, it's kind of a slap in the face.
You got wood chippers, you got chainsaws, you got lawnmowers that make more noise than my motorcycle does.
I look at the fact that there's,
We'll get into the lobby session and let you
Okay.
guys speak in a few minutes. Any other members of council? All right, now we're going to go into our lobby session. You have 3 minutes to speak, and we did have an email that came in that I'll have go first, that Nancy Linda is going to.
I'm speaking on behalf of Robin Spyak. Good evening. My husband and I reside at 6718 Case Road, North Ridgeville, Ohio. I would like to speak against the ordinance that would amend the use of ATVs on properties less than 5 acres. We are senior citizens that use our ATV for taking care of our landscaping, plowing snow, and other property maintenance. We are senior citizens. Although our property is large, it is under 5 acres. We are always respectful of our neighbors as well as we should be and abide by noise ordinance as it stands. Amending this ordinance for ATVs is greatly affects and cause hardship to us who have been residents of the city for 37 years. Thank you. Sincerely, Robin and John Spyak.
Next up, we have Tim Hart. Please state your name and address for the record.
Tim Hart, I live at 33062 Chestnut Ridge. My wife and I have been lifelong residents. We live in the house my wife grew up in. Been here for 65 years. When you're considering this legislation, I understand every individual situation is unique and it's different. Every 2 or 3 or 5 acre lot is not the same. Mine happens to be 100 feet wide. Maybe different problem areas in town, you know, are larger areas of land, wider tracks. I might suggest before you make a decision, check out some of these problem areas where there have been noise complaints and see for yourself what some of these situations are. And you're welcome at 33062 Chestnut Ridge. In addition to the unique situation, every four-wheeler, motorcycle, ATV is different. And you can have varying noises from all of these products. I used to ride a mini bike here in town. It was a 3.5 horsepower brakes and strap. It wasn't a 350. Okay, so I sympathize to some degree, but this is North Ridgeville 2021. We have 35,000 people here now. When you're looking at the size of the lots, And I know you did it with the hunting and that was brought up. And in our situation, the problem, folks, you know, we got the notice they're gonna hunt. And I have no problem, we have no problem with the hunting until I see deer running around with arrows sticking out of them. Hunting is not a problem, but they combine a lot next to them on the other side. Doing that, that's a quiet pastime, the bow hunting. If people are allowed to combine their acre and a half or 2 acres and combine it with the folks next door, they'll fit whatever guideline you come up with maybe, but then you're expanding the noise area and you're going to increase the number of people who don't have the noise-making vehicles, and you might be increasing the number of complaints. So the way I'm reading this, I'm hoping it's saying one individual lot. The combining just would compound the problem. We've just seen in the last couple of years, it's a very vocal, noisy group of people that seem to get their way. And they tend to be very vocal, very minor minority group of people. And I think here in North Ridgeville, we might have, what, a dozen or 2 dozen areas that are causing most of the complaints. So you've got a dozen or 2 dozen people doing the riding, and they're trying to shove the noise down the other 34,975 people in town. And you're not going to hear from the most of them because they don't have the neighbor next to them. You're not going to make everybody happy, no matter if it's this legislation or anything else. But think about the silent majority, because if you want to get support and votes, that's what you're going to have to do. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Next up, we have Mike Babbitt. Please state your name and address.
I clearly have Mike Babbitt. I'm reading for Mike Babbitt. Do you still want my name? His name. My name is Sue Wilson, and I'm at 37939 Sugar Ridge Road. Mike Babbitt is at 38601 Sugar Ridge Road. And he gave me just a few bullet points, some of which I'm not clear on, but I will just share it with you. And then he said to leave the paper with you. First bullet point, electric bikes make no noise, and this is the future. Size of lot should not matter. Professional arenas have 20 riders on an acre inside a stadium. To ride 2 or 3 bikes or ATVs in a half acre is not excessive or unheard of. Sound and nuisance laws already exist for complaints and should be enforced. This includes illegal, unlicensed road travel as well as trespassing. Rather than try to legislate to minimize and restrict riding, we should encourage responsible recreational riding. Our city received a grant and a free decibel meter. We won this because we said we would use it to educate local riders as well as street riders of the sound they create while riding. Also, how much louder aftermarket accessories can make a bike or an ATV. To my knowledge, we have not done this. I'm against restricting riding on private property as well as the proposed changes. Mike Babbitt. Thank you. Thanks to you. Sure.
Next up, we have Blaze Miller. Please state your name and address.
Blaze Miller, 5305 Case Road. I too grew up here. I've been employed with the city of North Ridgeville 34 years. So I hear what goes on via my police scanner radio on my excavator. I think the problem areas should be addressed. I don't agree with labeling or blackballing every ATV rider or restricting it by land. I personally, my wife and I have 13.5 acres. Our property butts up to Meadow Lakes and Avalon. If the ordinances are changed, possibly we wouldn't be able to ride on our one side of our property because we'd be too close on the 200 foot. But then it varies with the way the common ground is versus the Meadow Lakes backyards. So a couple years ago, we had to come and fight for the 200 foot to stay from a dwelling versus moving into a structure or fence on the property line. My first 800 or 900 foot, whatever it is 153 foot wide. Then after that, it branches out to 560 by 800 or 900. It's on its a second. It's all one parcel, but that back area is like 10 acres. I don't agree with shutting down at 6 o'clock. If I work for the city, paving your roads till 6 or 7, you're gonna tell me I can't come home and run down my trails or something because I'm in violation of the 6 o'clock ordinance. Again, 13.5 acres. Anyone wants to change the way my property is written, they can start paying my taxes. Because I pay a substantial amount of taxes to this city. And for a few bad apples, and don't take offense, chief, the police need to enforce the bad apples. I just, it's one thing after another. Someone said that this is the future. Well, why are we still building 3 and 4 houses on 1 acre? You're creating another Main, Broad, and Pleasant development so that people can literally reach out and shake hands in between their houses. Those same houses are green between them because they don't see the light of day because they're on top of each other. So whatever volume we're getting in taxes or whatnot, because of the smaller lots, go back to restricted lots. Lexington is a prime example. Those houses are all built on 5 acre lots, but the first 2. How do I know that? I landscaped the majority of those houses under new construction almost 30 years ago. So that's just my take. I don't agree with these changes or whatever is going to be possible. And the other thing about 4-wheeling at night, I too get home at 11 o'clock, 11:30 after plowing your city streets. I'm not going to be allowed to use my 4-wheeler on an 800-foot long driveway. I think it's total BS. Thank you.
Mr. Molesky, this doesn't snowplow.
Correct.
You put in different
And it
snow.
also doesn't change the distance from the property line either.
I just wanted to clarify that. Our next speaker is Sue Wilhelmi.
Sue Wilhelmi, 37939 Sugar Ridge Road. And I'm just here because it does concern me that we would be taking away property owners' rights to use their property, to use their equipment. I've lived in this city for 64 years, Sugar Ridge for 40-some years, and we do have this equipment. We've used it to plow our snow and to haul our wood and clean up our property. I don't have 5 acres. I have just under 3 acres, but I still would use all that equipment. And I think that we should be able to have the right to use it, knowing that we would be responsible neighbors with it. I'm also questioning if maybe we could look at the penalty portion of the ordinance and maybe work on that. Maybe we're not penalizing the people, the bad apples that are causing all of this grief, and if we know it's not that many, maybe we need to relook at how we're doing that. And maybe we're not doing enough that impacts them, and that's why it's continuously done. And I also would like just some more information on this 200 feet. It confuses me. If we're not able to use any of this type of equipment within 200 feet of another residence, that pretty much eliminates everybody in the whole city. Really, everybody, whether you have, I mean, you would have to have 13 acres or even more. But it would definitely eliminate anyone that lives in a housing development from even having this type of equipment. So anyone in Avalon or Meadow Lakes that has this equipment, they're already excluded from using it because their parcel doesn't allow it. So that's where I come to the penalty phase then. Are we doing enough to make it clear to these people this is not the proper use? Thank you.
We're speaking about bad apples. People that we're going to complaints with, they're not in violation of law. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're riding 200 feet away from a residential dwelling. I think we're making it sound like they're rogue riders. They're not rogue riders, they're riding in compliance with the law. But what it is the mechanism, continuation of the mechanism being used for 12 hours a day was generating complaints. In other words, these people aren't rogue. They're in compliance with the law, but the parcel they're riding on, 200 feet from a residential dwelling is not that far. But it's continuous all day riding that we're getting complaints on. So they're not, this is not where people are just doing whatever the hell they want. Of course, not doing anything about it. They're in compliance, it's 200 feet from a dwelling. They're using them 8 to 12 hours a day.
I don't understand how they could be 200 feet. I mean, I have nearly 3 acres, but my lot is only 100 foot wide.
Correct. But there are some that, like the gentleman
But
said
are those
before,
the ones they're causing the
two I
problem?
know, I know of.
I mean, it can't be in Meadow Lakes or Avalon, that's a housing development. Those are
It's
small
not.
parcels.
No.
If we can, this in order.
Well, all I'm saying is, when you say bad apples, they're not bad apples, they're riding within compliance with the law. They just continually ride for all hours of the day, every day of the week, the Sunday. These are mostly kids, for the most part. So it's not that they're bad apples, they're just doing what they can do in compliance with the current law.
All right, our next speaker is Tracy Dodsley.
I have no comment.
And Robin Spyak, that was the email you read, correct? Anybody else have any further questions or comments? No. State your name and address.
Steve Kemmer, 5481 Grace Circle, North Ridgeville. So I grew up in Avon, and the city grew up around me, and I kind of feel that's where North Ridgeville is right now. Our cul-de-sac, Sullivan Estates, butts up against Jaycox there, and we do have a neighbor that rides all the time. He's got exactly 2 acres on his property. He has roughly a half acre track built in the back. I've got a garage out back, the 1971 Buick Skylark in it, but that he's within 50 feet of that. I don't know if insurance starts coming into play in some of this. There's more laws on the books about noise ordinances. I DJ on the side. I've had more complaints about noise from tuning systems up and stuff like that I seem to get respect for on this side of things with the ATV and stuff like this. He brings and trailers in vehicles. He's had up to 7, I think, ATVs and dirt bikes going at the same time on this track. I think it's entirely too close. Again, 200 feet from a dwelling, I think that eliminates 97% of the city. So I think there are some things in the books already that help this out, but I think a little bit more is necessary as well. Thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions?
So I'm assuming that there's no commercial activity going on over there on the site.
All entertainment.
It's all entertainment.
Any other comments or questions? All right. This time I will entertain a motion. Yes, Mr.
I would agree that the 6 o'clock curfew on the ATVs is probably a bit too severe. And but I do believe that the ATVs should be moving within the same ordinances, noise ordinances that lawnmowers, construction equipment, and that live with it as well. But at the same time, such as the situation that you've listed, inviting other ATVers to use your property is not being a good neighbor, right? And we need to figure out how to, because yours is not the only property like that. I know of another property exactly doing the same thing in my ward. and possibly reduce the 5 acres. This- For those folks who've lived here a long time, I appreciate it. Appreciate your position, but North Ridgeville is growing. It is becoming. And so some changes are going to be made. They just never. Unless you point out, I don't see people should be operating ATVs in their backyard in Middle Lakes, Ridgefield, or Avalon Estates, and that type of thing, because the property is too small. Possibly to work on your equipment, it's a different story. But we do need to set some type of minimum. Maybe 5 acres is too much, but we do need to set a minimum, or I should say maximum. And as far as the argument is, and tractor and that, all those instruments are regulated as far as time is concerned, and they're doing a specific job. And typically, once or twice a week, an hour or so, and they're done. ATVs, on the other hand, they're operating, many of them are operating 5-6 hours a day, and it could be more days on end. I had that resident where that's what he complains about. He's operating 7 days a week, 4 or 5 hours on weekdays and 8, 10, 12 hours on weekends, right up against his property. He's not only dealing with noise, but he's also dealing with the dust that generates. That's not fair to the resident who's not operating the ATV. Yeah. The other example, as far as controlling dust, I can use is there's a horse farm on Sugar Ridge. He has to, by city ordinance, control his dust. And he does. At least I said I've heard. And so the ATVers should not be looking for an exemption from that either. I appreciate that. And I have to admit, I do have an ATV operator, again, in my ward. When I talked to them about it, they said we wouldn't even think about operating our ATV within the North Ridgeville city. So we take it out where we're accepted. As far as they're concerned, North Ridgeville is too built up now for ATVs. So those are some of the things that possibly what we need to do is look at some of these provisions, adjust them a little bit, and I'll make a motion that we set up another meeting and we adjust some of these points here, and possibly make it less severe, but still protect the citizens within North Ridgeville who are not ATV operators.
All right, move to for the discussion, another meeting.
Yes. Yes.
No, yes, no. All right, with no further business for this committee, the meeting is now adjourned.